Good evening and good morning, everyone. I welcome all of you to this online webinar on Azure Architecting. I hope I'm audible to all of you and my screen is visible to all of you. So I would be your host for this webinar, and let me introduce myself first. Then we will continue with the webinar topic. So my name is Sanjay Singh and I have 14 year plus of experience into IT training as well as into production. And I do have certification in the same domain where I have certification into Microsoft Cloud as a Microsoft. I have certification into Microsoft Fundamental, Microsoft Administration, Microsoft Azure Architecting and Designing, Microsoft Azure Security, Microsoft Azure Networking Specialist, and Microsoft Azure Hybrid. Apart from Azure domain, I have certification into Windows Server family as well, where I have certification into Windows Server 2003, 2008, 2012, 2016, and MCSC into private cloud. Apart from Microsoft Server domain, I have certification into AWS Cloud as well. So AWS Cloud Practitioner, AWS Cloud Solution Architect Associate, and Professional AWS Cloud Networking Specialist. So apart from AWS domain, I have certification into Huawei routing and switching and Cisco routing and switching. I have certification into Red Hat as well as a Red Hat administrator, and I have a certification as a authorized trainer into AWS, into Microsoft, and into Huawei. So it's a quick introduction about me. Now, let me guide you about the topics which we are going to discuss in this webinar so that we all would be able to understand if you are going to use Azure Cloud, how you will architect, how you will design your resources into Azure, and how you will give a solution to your customers when it comes to Azure. So, today's agenda is we're going to discuss about, first of all, overview of Azure Compute, then networking components, which would be a core part for any cloud service provider, and then migration services, just because when it comes to migrating resources, so it would be difficult for us to understand from where we will start migration. Correct. So I'm going to guide you tools which we can use into Azure and the options which would be available through which you would be able to migrate your resources from on-premises to Azure, from other clouds to Azure as well. Let's start with Azure Compute Services. When it comes to Azure, if we're going to understand compute service, so let me guide you. If we are going to talk about a cloud service provider, if I'm talking about a cloud service provider, so and if I'm particularly I'm going to talk about Azure, so Azure services are available into multi regions. Correct. So first I need to select one region. First I need to choose one region where I'm going to deploy my resources. So first I will choose my region. Inside Azure regions, there would be availability zones would be there. AZ1, 2, 3. When I'm saying AZ1, what it does mean? It means there would be a data center inside that availability zone. So there could be one data center or there could be collections of data center. That means more than one data center could be also possible. So might be Azure is going to acquire one single building in that location, which depends supply and demand. Correct. So based on the supply and demand, based on the requirement, might be there would be only single building, which is known as single data center, which Azure is going to acquire, or might be Azure is going to acquire a campus where you will get multiple buildings. Correct. So which is known as more than one data center. So that is possible that inside a availability zone, you will get single data center or more than one data center. When I'm talking about multi-AZ, so we can use multiple availability zones for high availability and scalability purpose, where I can scale my application, I can maintain high availability, I can increase SLA for my application, which I'm going to deploy. So I would be able to easily design my application, which will be highly scalable and available application into the cloud. And that is the basically benefit of cloud. You will get high availability and scalability in the cloud. So you will get high availability, scalability, correct. You can easily choose your location based on the compliance, based on the local data regulatory compliance. You can choose your region, or you can choose your region which would be nearest to your end user to reduce the latency. So there are many factors which can affect your region selection, and based on that, would be also a factor. Based on that reason, you will select your geography, correct, and inside your region, you will get multiple availability zones, which you can use for high availability purpose. So you can design a highly available application. So right now we have 60 plus regions into Azure into 140 countries. As compared to AWS, in AWS we have 28 regions right now. Hyderabad region is also live into India. So previously there was only one region into India, which was Mumbai for AWS. Correct. So now we have Hyderabad region also into India. So we have total 28 regions for AWS. As compared to AWS, you will get more regions for Microsoft Azure, correct? Now, when it comes to compute resources, compute services, so when I'm saying compute service, what it does mean? It means I'm talking about virtual machine, correct? Or I'm talking about storage, correct? I'm talking about app services. So when it comes to Azure cloud particularly, so we are talking about Azure virtual machines, we are talking about Azure app services, we are talking about container services, we are talking about AKS, Azure Kubernetes services, we are talking about virtual desktop, Windows virtual desktop, VDI service into Azure. So when I'm talking about virtual machine, how virtual machine help me to host my application, how this service will help me. So when I'm talking about compute resources, so there would be three service model which comes in picture. Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So this virtual machines comes under into infrastructure as a service. Now, what is infrastructure as a service? So infrastructure as a service means, again, in cloud, there would be mixed responsibility, correct? So, and where I would be responsible for few of the resources and my service provider would be responsible for managing those resources. So responsibility is mixed, shared when it comes to cloud and when it comes to public cloud. So when it comes to infrastructure as a service, so host computer, where my virtual machine will be placed, that will be managed by my service provider. Correct. Storage, network switches, physical data center, all these will be managed by my service provider. So based on my requirement, if I'm going to host any application into cloud, so basically there would be some standard requirement to host your application, standard hardware requirement, where you need two virtual CPU and 4 GB RAM, correct? You need 50 GB storage. So this would be your requirement. Based on your requirement, what you will do, you will create one virtual machine and you will choose your operating system, either Windows or Linux, correct? So assume I'm going to deploy a application, .NET application on Windows Server 2016, correct? So I will create one virtual machine with this compute requirement. So Azure will give me one virtual machine for which I would be responsible. What it does mean by you would be responsible? It means Azure will give you one virtual machine which you have to access and you need to manage this virtual machine. So inside your VM, you would be responsible for configuring your services. You would be responsible for installing your tools, services. Correct. If I'm going to host a .NET application, I need to install .NET Core runtime. So and their dependencies. So I would be responsible. It means I have to manage all these things. If I'm going to use this virtual machine for SQL database, so I will download my database, I will install my database, I would be responsible for backup, high availability, maintenance, patching, everything. I would be responsible just because I'm using infrastructure as a service where I would be responsible for managing this virtual machine. When it comes to PaaS, platform as a service, so Azure App Services, they comes under into PaaS solution. Correct? So what it does mean by PaaS and what benefit you will get. So again, being a developer who don't have knowledge of infrastructure, who don't know what is that virtual network, how I will configure my VNet, my firewall, correct? If I don't know all these things and I don't know how to create virtual machine, how to connect virtual machine to install my runtime, it would be difficult for me to manage my infrastructure. So being a developer, what I need a platform where I can test my code. Rather than focusing on my infrastructure, I can focus on my business continuity. Correct. So I will need a service into my cloud providers console. So app services would be a service where you would be able to host your applications. You would be able to host your API apps, your mobile application, and easily you can test your services. Rather than focusing on underlying infrastructure, you can easily deploy your application, correct? And where you will only test your code. So up to runtime, it means if I have expertise into Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, so assume I have expertise into Java and I need a platform where I can run my Java code. I can test my Java code or application which is written into Java. I can test that application. So Azure will give you a infrastructure. Okay. And where again Azure is using a virtual machine. So this VM, operating system of VM, runtime, that means Java, that will be managed by service provider. So you will simply bring your code. So being a developer, you will bring your code, you will host your code, and you will test your application. Rest, high availability, scalability, everything is managed by your service provider. Service provider would be responsible for underlying infrastructure. That is called app services. Correct. So it's a platform as a service. When it comes to container instances, now what it does mean by containers? So containers means if I'm talking about containers, so container which comes under into microservices architecture. When I'm saying microservices architecture, what it does mean? So it means assume, let me go back here. So assume I'm going to host one application which would be e-commerce application where I have multiple parts of my application. Like I have a products tab, I have a search tab, I have a orders tab, and I have a payment tab. Correct. So I have multiple tabs on my applications and where I'm getting requests, different API call, correct, from internet. And all these parts of applications are hosted on a single server. So assume I'm getting more requests for orders, correct, as compared to other tabs. And where I need to scale, just because when I'm getting more requests, it means there would be load on this tab. So I need to scale this tab. So when you are using this type of architecture, you have to scale complete virtual machine or complete physical server resource, correct? Just because of one part of your application. So how we can give a solution where if there would be a requirement to scale only one part, on audits tab, only products tab, only search tab. So how I can scale individual tabs. So this type of architecture is known as monolithic environment. So nowadays we are using microservices architecture where we are using container services, correct? So you can create containers for your application. You can divide your application into smaller parts, which are known as containers and which comes under into microservice architecture. Like there would be one container for products, there would be one container for search, there would be another container for orders, there would be another container for payment. If I'm getting more load on orders tab, I can create orders container, multiple orders container. Correct. That is possible. I can scale only orders container. If I'm getting more requests for products, I can scale products individually into microservices architecture. If any part of my application will be down, it will not impact on my whole application. Other parts of application will be available, correct? But into monolithic environment, if any part will be failed, there would be effect on your whole application. And might be your users will face experience, downtime experience. So that's why we are using microservices nowadays, correct? When it comes to microservices, so if you will compare with physical server, virtual machine, so how it is different than physical server and microservice, your virtual machine. So basically, when it comes to a physical server, let's assume. So on physical server, there would be a hardware, correct? And assume you're using 16 watt or CPU or CPU, and you are using 64 GB RAM on your server. So top of your hardware, you will install a hypervisor, which would be assumed we have different types of hypervisors like ESXi, we have Hyper-V, we have Citrix 10 server. So I can use any hypervisor, which I will install top of my hardware. Or if I'm using physical server, so my rather than using hardware, this hypervisor might be I'm using Windows or Linux or Mac. This would be my operating system which I'm using top of my hardware. So if I'm using Windows or Linux or Mac and I need to use microservice architecture, so what I will do, I will download Docker engine, and which is known as basically Docker daemon. You can say Docker daemon. So Docker engine which you will download on your operating system, and then top of your Docker, let's assume this would be my OS now, operating system, and here I downloaded Docker. And top of my Docker, I will create my containers, which will contain my application. Now, what are container? So container are small units which will contain your application. So you will bind your application into a smaller image, correct? Which way where you do not have any operating system. It will only run your user portion, and you can tailor your user portion as per your requirement. You can edit, you can customize. So there would be no kernel inside your application. Remember this thing into microservices architecture. So if there would be no kernel, it means it will use it will consume less resources as compared to virtual machine. Just because creating virtual machine on top of my hypervisor, I need to install a complete operating system. Correct. And after that, I need to use my runtime, my binary files, my application. So which will take Zoom might be it will take 2 GB RAM and uh, 40 GB storage and two virtual CPUs. When you will compare this architecture with microservices, so your one container can take 200 MB RAM. So it will take less resources as compared to virtual machine. So it would be a lightweight resource which you can deploy, redeploy, you can replace from one server to another server as well. Easily you can move, correct? And you would be able to scale your application immediately if there would be any requirement. So containers where there would be no operating system, if there would be no operating system, it would be a lightweight unit where you can run your application like Tomcat or Linux or Windows Core Server or Alpine, correct? So you can host your applications and you would be able to easily manage your multi-tier application through microservices architecture. So where if you have knowledge of Docker and container, correct? So in Azure, you can use container instances, which comes under into PaaS solution. It means it's a managed service which is given by Azure to you to host your application. So you can use container instances rather than downloading Docker and rather than installing Docker inside a virtual machine. Correct. Simply you will use this service where you can host your application. That is known as container instances, ACI, Azure Container Instances. If I need a automated tool orchestrator into Azure, I will use Azure Kubernetes services. Orchestrator, which would be responsible for recovering your nodes, which would be responsible for placing your containers on nodes. Correct. So you will get a orchestrator, which would be a cluster where you will run your application, your containers. Correct. And containers will be run ultimately on nodes. Nodes are basically virtual machines where your container will run, and you will get auto scaling feature, you will get auto recovery feature, you will get persistent storage for your containers, and easily you would be able to manage your deployment for your application into a automated way. When it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop, so in Windows Virtual Desktop, you will get same VDI feature like if I'm talking about Citrix VDI. So same feature you will get into Microsoft as well, where you can create one virtual machine and you would be able to share your desktop to multiple users. And you can restrict your user to access particular application. So same experience, same configuration you can do on Microsoft as well by using Windows Virtual Desktop Service VDI service into Azure. That is called Azure Compute Service. Next, when it comes to networking, so when it comes to customization into cloud for any service provider, I'm not talking about particularly Azure. So this would be applies on all service provider. When it comes to customization, solution, correct? Just because if I'm working as the solution architect into any organization, so any client who will come with some specific requirement, so I need to give a solution based on the requirement. It means there would be customization, and I have to customize his application, his deployment, his blueprint based on the requirement. So where VNet will come in picture as your virtual network. Azure Virtual Network, which will be an isolated environment within one Azure account, within one region for your application. So if you need isolation, if you need customization, if you have to maintain your traffic, which is coming from internet for multi-tier application, assume I'm going to host 3-tier application. To hosting 3-tier application, what I need a network environment where I can filter my traffic, inbound and outbound traffic. So I will create one VNet in which I will create my subnet. So if I'm talking about 3-tier application, so my first subnet will be web tier, second will be app tier, third will be DB, or you can say front end, back end database. Correct. So when it comes to 3-tier application architecture and we need customization where we need to deploy more than one instances for web for high availability purpose, we need to deploy more than one instance for app, we need to deploy more than one database, master and standby database for high availability purpose so that we can increase SLA of our application. I can design all these things within a VNet. I can filter my traffic just because web instances. So web instances will be directly exposed to internet. When I'm saying directly exposed to internet, what it does mean? It means in your firewall rule, you will use this rule. 0.0.0/0. It means all traffics are allowed to this instances, this subnet resources on port number 80 or port number 443. So whatever port you will open, so if this would be a web application, you will open port number 80 or port number 443, which will entertain by your web instances. Similarly, when it comes to app, so from your web instance, virtual machines internally, your app instances will receive traffic on which port? Port number 443. So after then your app instance resources, they will send traffic internally to your master database. On which port? Depends on which DB you are using. So might be you are using SQL or might be you are using MySQL. So if you are using SQL, you will use port number 1433, which you will open. If you are using MySQL, you will open port number 3306 to listen your traffic. So you can allow your traffic, you can filter your traffic based on your requirement, and you all would be able to entertain traffic which is coming from one tier to another tier. Correct, that is that you can maintain or manage through VNet. So VNet will provide you a virtual private cloud within Azure, where you can manage, you can customize your traffic, you can customize your placement, you can route your traffic based on your requirement. Next, Azure load balancer. When it comes to Azure load balancer, so for high availability purpose, if I'm going to create more than one instance. Correct. So how I can ensure that traffic which I'm receiving from internet, traffic will be distributed to my all identical instances, which I'm using for high availability purpose. So we will use load balancer. Correct. So in Azure, we have two types of load balancer: standard load balancer and application gateway. So you will get application gateway or standard load balancer. Standard load balancer which works on layer 7, OSI layer 7. So based on the TCP and UDP protocol, it will filter your traffic, it will distribute your traffic. By default, it supports round robin algorithm. And what is round robin algorithm? It means your load balancer will distribute requests evenly to all backend resources, that is one by one. Next option is VPN gateway. When it comes to hybrid connectivity, hybrid means I'm going to host my application into Azure. Correct. And I already have a data center, on-prem data center. So there would be some compliance rule. Let's assume I'm going to build one application for my banking client, for a financial organization, where there would be data regulatory compliance which state that you need to create your application into a hybrid environment just because customer data is more important. So in that case, you will decide whether you need to run your application all parts into cloud or into on premises just because of security reasons. So how you will decide? So in that case, what I can do, my front end I can deploy into Azure, and my back end which I can deploy, that means my database, I can deploy into on premises just because in on premises I have full control over the infrastructure and I would be responsible for security. So this would be a secure place for my customer data. So and now I need to enable integration from Azure to on-prem, where I will use VPN gateway. So Azure VPN gateway, which is again under into platform as a service, it's a managed resource managed by Azure. So you will get highly available and scalable resource. So you don't need to worry about scaling and high availability. This will be managed by Azure. Simply you need to use this device and you need to connect your on-premise data center with Azure, and you would be able to connect your application. You can enable your communication from Azure to on premises. Azure Application Gateway, when it comes to content based routing or URL based routing, correct? What it does mean by content based routing, URL based routing, it means if I'm talking about layer 7 traffic, layer 7 traffic means assume my web application URL is www.xyz.com, correct? And again, I'm hosted a e-commerce website, and my website URL is www.xyz.com. So any user who is requesting for orders, correct? So for orders, I'm using in backend two servers for orders. And similarly for products, I'm using two different servers, which will be different. And for search, I'm using might be Azure Functions, correct? For search. And for payment gateway, I'm using on-prem servers. Correct. So how I will decide, how my load balancer will decide if load balancer is receiving requests for orders. So request should send to orders pool where we have two servers, identical servers for high availability purpose. And my request will be sent to orders servers. Or if any user who is sending request for payment, so their request should be sent to on-premise physical server. So that is called layer 7 request, where it will check, your load balancer will check layer 7 content, URL content, correct? So you can use application gateway, again that is also a managed service which is managed by Azure, and you would be able to use that service where you will get a highly available scalable application layer load balancer. And what one benefit you will also get, which would be web application firewall, web application firewall support. So you can implement web application firewall, which will protect your layer 7 content from DDoS attack and from cross-site scripting, SQL injections. So it will protect your website. Next option, we have CDN, content delivery network. So if I'm going to host my application, assume into US East, and my application is a dynamic application into Azure, where there would be few static content on my application like images, some PDF file, some audio, video, so which I uploaded into a storage account, into a blob storage. Correct. So now I have a global presence. So where there would be customer into India, there would be customer from other countries. So customers or end users who are sending requests from India, Indian region. So if they're sending requests from here, they will face latency as compared to US customer. Correct. So I need to reduce latency. How I will reduce latency? So except then availability zones and regions, Azure is having a another concept which is known as POP locations, caching, CDN service, which is also known as edge servers. So in all regions, you will get edge servers, which would be nearest server for your end user, and where you will enable caching services, which is known as content delivery network. Correct. So it will provide a distributed network of the servers, which will be different in availability zone and regions. Correct. Which will cache your content to the nearest edge server. And when user will request, so user's request will be sent to first of all edge server, and then this content will be served locally through that edge server. So which will reduce latency of your application and which will increase performance of your application. That is called CDN service. Correct. So it's a caching service. When it comes to migration, so migrating your resource, so for migration, as you can see, assess your workload first. What it does mean by assess your workload, it means if I'm going to migrate my data center, or might be I'm going to migrate my data only onto Azure, so which tool, which service I can use, I can assess my resources if I'm going to migrate my whole data center. So this would be my on-prem data center where I have multiple applications, databases, correct servers, and I'm planning to migrate whole data center. First, I will assess my data center. So I will use tools through which I would be able to assess my data center. So after assessment, you will get a report. Correct. In report, you will get complete readiness. Servers which you can migrate on Azure without any change, which is known as rehosting. Rehosting means completely I can move my server completely to the Azure without any change. That is called rehosting. Correct. So without any change. So if I'm planning to migrate, I'm going to use infrastructure as a service. That means Azure virtual machines. So where I would be able to host my application, I can host my database, SQL database if I'm using, or any other databases which I'm using into my on-premises, I can host those databases. So I can do that. So without the risk, and there would be no cost associated, correct? And the code will not change. So you can directly rehost from on-premise to your Azure infrastructure. Second, which we are which we second pattern which we can use, where you again with your report after assessment, you will get reports in which you will get readiness. In readiness, you will get that there would be few resources which you can migrate, but with few changes, which is known as refactoring. Correct. That is known as refactoring. Refactor your application. Correct that, or oftenly you can just say like a repackaging of your application with minimal changes. So you can migrate your application, but with minimal changes, just because if you will do these changes, you would be able to use past resources on Azure, where Azure would be responsible for underlying infrastructure, and you can easily host your application either on Azure Web Apps, or you can host on Azure AKS service, Azure Kubernetes services, where you have to do some changes, minor changes. Correct. With minor changes, you would be able to deploy your resources. You would be able to migrate your resources on Azure. Correct. And if you want to apply any innovation through DevOps practice, which will be provided by Azure, so refactor will come in picture, where you will use refactoring pattern to migrate your resources. Next, we have next option which we can use is re-architecting. Re-architect. So in re-architect, your migration goal will be focused on modifying or extending your app functionality. So either you will modify your application from on-premises, or you are going to change your application. Correct. You are going to extend your application. You're going to change your database. You're going, if you're using Azure, Microsoft SQL database. So in Azure, you are going to use fully managed database, which will be managed by Azure. So in that case, high availability, scalability, everything is managed by Azure. You don't need to worry about the, you don't need to worry about the underlying infrastructure. You only need to focus on your business continuity. Similarly, I can choose managed instances by Azure. I can use Azure database on MySQL, or I can use PostgreSQL, Oracle database, or Cosmos DB. Again, it depends. So where re-architecting, I will re-architect, redesign my application. Correct. That is called re-architecting into Azure, which you will, again, you will get a readiness report, just because when it comes to readiness report, assessing your workload, after assessment, you will get a report in which you will get a complete readiness about your infrastructure. So resources which you can migrate, you will get complete full of list of those resources, and which infrastructure as a service you can use, that you will also get, and what would be pricing, you will get complete information. Resources which you can migrate with minimal changes, you will get complete list of those resources. Resources which you can't migrate, in that case you need to either re-architect or rebuild your resources. Correct. So that you would be able to meet with the requirement on Azure. Next, there are multiple tools for migration. You can compare your tool, which tool you're going to use based on the compliance, based on the requirement. Or if you're migrating a database only, you're going to migrate complete data center, or you're going to migrate your resources from other cloud, you can choose your tool. Migrating your database. So if I'm only going to migrate my database, so which tool I can use? Select an online storage migration tool. If I'm migrating my storage, so I can choose either online or offline. If offline, so which tool I can use? Correct. So all these options you need to consider first, you need to understand first. After then you would be able to choose your tool. So when it comes to migrate your resources on Azure, what would be your scenario? Windows Server workload. It means I have Windows Server which I'm going to migrate. Correct, on Azure. So on-premise Windows virtual machines without database, we can migrate on Azure. SQL Server workload, if I'm going to host any database which is hosted inside my data center, so database and other functionality which is running on SQL Server virtual machines, you can host, you can migrate on Azure. Linux workload, yes, you can migrate, which is running on Red Hat or SUSE or any Hadoop containers. ASP.NET, PHP, Java applications, which are hosted for customer facing and internet facing applications, that is front end. So you can host that, you can migrate those applications also on Azure. SAP HANA application, yes. So enterprise resource planning with centralized database. Specialized computer, that means HPC, high performance computing for batch processing. Yes, we can migrate. So we can migrate all resources on Azure based on your requirement, which tool we can use. So these would be your tools which you can use. First tool which we can use is Azure Migrate Server Assessment. So first we will do server assessment. So physical servers and on-premise virtual machines which are running on either on VMware or on Hyper-V servers. So if my virtual machine is running, or if my data center is running on Hyper-V, So I will get a VHD file for assessment. Correct. Through this VHD file, I will create one virtual machine inside my on-premise data center, which I will connect to my network. Correct. And this VM is your assessment server, which will assess your resources, data center resources. Similarly, if I'm using VMware ESXi servers. So I will get a .ova file through which I will create one virtual machine, which I will connect to my network and which will run the assessment discovery, which will run the discovery and it will start assessment. So you can assess your resources, your physical servers, your virtual machines, Hyper-V, VMware virtual machines inside your data center, and you will get a assessment report. Azure Migrate server migration, we can do physical server migration as well for on-premises, VMware, Hyper-V, and other cloud virtual machines as well. Like if we have Windows virtual machine into AWS cloud, we would be able to migrate those virtual machines as well to Azure. Migrating your database. So again, first you will assess your database. So there would be assessment which will be done by Microsoft. So assessment for Microsoft on-premise, Microsoft SQL Server database, or which Azure tool you will use, which Azure service you will use, infrastructure managed or managed instance by Azure, which is provided by Azure, or you are going to use Azure virtual machine to hosting your database. You will get complete assessment along with the recommendation. Then database migration, you will migrate your data from existing on-premise database to database running in Azure server. Azure app assessment. So if you are going to host any application or migrating any application from on-premises to Azure, yes, you will do assessment first for your applications and then you will get recommendation. These are the services where you can run your application on Azure. Then Azure Data Box. What is Azure Data Box? When it comes to offline data migration into Azure, to offline data migration, which tool I can use? I can use Data Box for offline migration. So Data Box is a tool where there are two ways through which I can do migration of my data. So, or I can transfer my data from on-premises to cloud. First way will be job, where I can create import and export job, and which would be an online option. Correct. So directly I can create a job and I will prepare my disk. That means I already have one disk which I can use, and or I can use storage gateway to upload my data directly. Second option, I can use data box. In data box, we have data box and data disk. The two options, data disk and data boxes. Correct. So data box, data disk, you will get up to 35 TB storage, where you will get 8 disks from Azure to store your data and to migrate your data. And each disk contain 8 TB storage. Similarly, if I have if I have larger data which I'm planning to migrate or planning to shift into Azure, I need a data box where you will get up to 100 TB storage. Correct. Data disk which you will connect to USB 3.0, data box which you will connect to your RJ45 port into your data center, and you will first of all shift your data, transfer your data into Azure data box, and after then you will shift this data box to Azure data center, nearest data center, and they will locally upload your data into your storage account. That is called data migration through Azure data box. So now we are done with our topic. Thank you everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. Bye bye.